There is a kind of silence that falls over a great hall not because nothing is happening, but because something is happening that no one has words for yet. I have stood inside that silence 3 times in 40 years of service, and I remember each of them the way a man remembers the faces of the dead. The morning the Crown Prince took up the Queen Consort's roll of offices was the 3rd, and it is the one I have never stopped turning over in my hands. My name is Aldous Fenwick. I was on that morning Warden of the Household Keys, the least glamorous of the senior posts in the Royal House of Harrowgate, and the one that saw the most. A Warden of Keys does not guard the king's body. The sworn men do that, and I had done it once in a younger frame. A Warden of Keys guards the doors between rooms, the ledgers that say which door may be opened by which hand, the boxes of seals and warrants and household writs that let a great palace run without every servant asking the king himself whether the linens might be changed. It is dull work described. It is not dull work done. A man who holds the keys learns the whole architecture of a house, not the stone, but the power that flows through the stone, and he learns it precisely because no one thinks the key holder is worth lying to. They lie to the ministers. They lie to the king. They do not bother to lie to the man who unlocks the pantry. That is how I came to know, before anyone else in Harrowgate knew, that something was rotten in the accounts of the Queen Consort's household. But I am ahead of myself, and a warden does not skip the order of things. Let me set the doors first, so you understand the house you are standing in. The great hall of Harrowgate, the hall of the elder kings, we called it, though the name was older than any king I could name, ran the length of the palace's western wing, and on the morning I am speaking of it was crowded to the walls. It was the feast of the realm's founding, the one day of the year when the whole court assembled in one room in full state, the lords of the near counties and the far, the ministers with their chains of office, the ambassadors of the neighboring realms in their strange collars, the whole ceremonial guard drawn up in 2 long ranks of red and steel down the center aisle. I stood at the head of the western rank, where a warden stands, with the ring of the household keys cold against my hip beneath the tunic, and the tall black bearskin making a wall of every man in the line. At the far end, on the dais of 3 steps, sat King Alaric. He was old that year, our king, older than his 60-odd winters, worn down the way a good blade is worn down when it has been used too long for work beneath it. He had been a strong man once. I had seen him ride down a company of raiders on the northern road when I was a boy new to the guard, and he was a prince not much older, and I had carried the memory of that day the way you carry a coin you will not spend. But the years had taken the ride out of his legs and the certainty out of his eyes, and though he still held himself straight upon the seat of the elder kings, there was a slowness in him now, a habit of looking to others before he spoke, that had not been there when Isolde was alive. Isolde, the late queen. I will speak of her because you cannot understand what happened that morning without her, though she had been dead 9 years by then and lay in the crypt beneath the very floor we stood upon. She had been the king's first wife, the mother of Crown Prince Rowan, and she had been, I will say it plainly, because a warden is trusted to be plain, the finest sovereign that house had produced in living memory, and she was never even the crowned one. She was the consort. But she ran the household as a sea captain runs a ship, and the king, who loved her, let her, and the realm was the better for it. When she died of the wasting fever, the whole house went into a grief that did not lift for a year, and the king's own light dimmed with it and never fully came back. 2 years after Isolde's death, the king married again. He married the Lady Morwenna, a widow of a great southern house, a woman of high beauty and higher pride, who came to Harrowgate with a grown son from her first marriage, Lord Cassius, and a daughter, the Lady Verena, and a manner that made the old servants exchange looks they were careful not to be caught exchanging. I will try to be fair to the Queen Consort Morwenna, because a warden's fairness is the one thing he owns that no one can take from him. She was not stupid. She was not lazy. She learned the workings of the household faster than any newcomer I had ever seen, and within 3 years of her marriage she held the same roll of offices Isolde had held: the household seal, the writ of provisioning, the charge of the king's charities, the management of the great feasts and audiences, the keeping of the roll of servants' pay. That roll of offices is what the court called the consort's charge, and it was an enormous power, quiet and total, the power to move money and men through the veins of the palace without any minister's leave. Isolde had held it and used it for the house. Morwenna held it and used it. I did not know for what that morning. That was the thing I had come to the feast half knowing and wholly afraid to know. Beside the king, one step down, stood the crown prince. Rowan of Harrowgate was then a man of perhaps 35, and if you have ever seen a son who is his mother's son in every part but the face, you have seen him. He had Isolde's stillness, her way of listening that made you feel weighed and, if you were honest, not found wanting. He had the king's height and none of the king's late uncertainty. He was married to the Princess Alara, a gentle, clear-eyed woman the whole realm loved without being told to, and they had 3 children: Torin, who was 11 that year and grave beyond it; Malin, who was 9 and afraid of nothing; and little Bram, who was 6 and asleep against a nursemaid's shoulder somewhere behind the dais, because 6 is too young for the feast of the founding, and everyone knew it but the boy himself. I tell you all this because a house is not stone. A house is the people in it and the trust between them, and the doors a warden keeps are only the visible shape of that trust. On the morning I am describing, the trust in Harrowgate was about to be tested in a way it had not been tested in 9 years, and I was standing at the head of the western rank with a ring of keys against my hip and a knowledge in my chest that I had told no one, because I did not yet have the proof to make the knowledge safe to speak. The chamberlain came forward to read the day's proclamations. That is a formality. On the feast of the founding, the chamberlain reads the honors and the appointments the king has made in the past year, a promotion here, a grant of land there, the small ceremonial business of a realm rendered into a long dry list that the court endures standing up. I had heard the reading 40 times. I could have recited its rhythm in my sleep. So when the chamberlain, a careful old man named Osric, who had held his post longer than I had held mine, unrolled the day's list and began to read, I let my attention go where a guard's attention goes, out along the ranks, watching hands and faces, the way a man watches a room he is responsible for. Then Osric's voice changed. It was a small thing, a pause, a half-breath, the tiny catch a reader makes when he comes to a line he has read in advance and did not like. I brought my eyes back to him. He had gone slightly pale, and he was holding the scroll a little too tightly, and he read the next passage in the flat, careful voice of a man who has decided to hide behind the words themselves. By the king's hand and seal, Osric read, and by the counsel of the crown and the leave of the council of the realm, it is proclaimed that the offices of the consort's charge, the household seal, the writ of provisioning, the charge of the royal charities, the ordering of the feasts and audiences of state, and the keeping of the roll of the household's pay, are, from this day, removed from the hand of the Queen Consort Morwenna, and placed in the keeping of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince Rowan, to be held and administered by him in the king's name, until the king in his wisdom shall order otherwise. I have stood in cannon fire quieter than the hall went then. You must understand what had just been said, because the words are dry and the meaning was an earthquake. The consort's charge had belonged to the Queen of Harrowgate, first Isolde, then Morwenna, for as long as anyone could remember. It was not merely a set of duties. It was the visible sign that the consort stood second only to the king in the running of the house, that she held his trust in the most intimate and total way a person could hold it. To strip it from Morwenna was to say, before the whole assembled court and the ambassadors of 4 realms, that the king no longer trusted his wife with the keeping of his house. And to place it, this was the part that made the ambassadors lean to their neighbors and whisper, to place it not with another lady, not with a minister, not with a council, but with the crown prince, the son of the first wife, the heir who had every reason in the world to be the second wife's rival. It was unprecedented. In 400 years of that house, it had never once been done. The realm in that moment was left, as the criers would later put it, stunned. I did not look at the king. I did not look at the crown prince. A guard learns to watch the person from whom the danger will come, and I looked at the Queen Consort Morwenna, who stood at the left of the dais in a gown the color of old wine, and I watched her face when the words landed. She did not cry out. I will give her that. She never once in the whole of what followed cried out. But I saw the color go out of her lips, and I saw her hand close on the rail of the dais the way a person's hand closes when the floor has shifted. And I saw, this is the thing I remember, the thing I have never been able to unsee. I saw her eyes go, for one bare instant, not to the king who had signed the order, and not to the crown prince who now held her power, but to the great arched doorway at the far end of the hall. She looked at the door. And I, who kept every door in that palace, followed her look, and I saw standing in the shadow of the arch a man I had last seen 3 weeks before, at midnight, carrying a locked strongbox out of a room he had no key to enter. His name was Cassius. He was her son, and in that instant I understood that the earthquake we had all just felt was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one. The beginning had happened weeks before, in the dark, behind doors, in the ledgers of a house that trusted its queen, and I was the only man in that hall who had already begun, without quite meaning to pull the thread that had unraveled it. Let me go back, then, to the night the thread first caught on my key. It was a night in the wet part of autumn, 3 weeks before the feast, and I was walking the household round, which a warden does not have to do himself, but which I did anyway, because a man who lets younger hands do all his walking soon forgets the shape of his own house. The round takes a man down the service corridors of the western wing, the ones the court never sees, where the linen presses are, and the plate room, and the counting room where the household clerks keep the ledgers of the consort's charge. It was past midnight. The corridors were dark but for the watch lamps, and the palace had that particular stillness a great building has when the powerful are asleep, and only the servants and the guards are awake to keep the world from stopping. I came around the corner by the plate room, and I saw a light under the door of the counting room. Now the counting room was locked at night. It was one of the doors I kept the key to, and by long custom it was opened at dawn by the chief household clerk, a spidery, careful man named Peveril who had kept the consort's ledgers for 20 years, and it was locked again at dusk by the same hand, and between dusk and dawn no one entered it, because the ledgers of the consort's charge were the most sensitive papers in the house short of the king's own treaties. Money is the truest secret a great house keeps. A man can hide a love affair or a grudge. He cannot hide from a good ledger where the coin has gone. So a light under that door at midnight was a wrong thing, and I have spent my life learning to walk toward wrong things quietly. I did not go to the door. I stepped back into the shadow of the plate room's arch, and I waited and I watched, because a warden who barges in learns one thing, that the door was open, while a warden who waits learns everything else. And after a time the light moved, and the door opened, and a man came out carrying a strongbox in both arms, the small iron kind with a hasp, the kind the clerks used to carry loose coin between the counting room and the treasury. The man was Lord Cassius. I knew him at once, though the corridor was dark, because a man's carriage gives him away long before his face does, and Cassius carried himself the way a man carries himself who has never in his life been told no, and has decided the word does not apply to him. He was the Queen Consort's son by her first marriage, a big, handsome, soft-handed man of perhaps 40, who had come to Harrowgate on his mother's marriage and had spent the years since finding the softest chairs in the palace and sitting in them. He held no office. He commanded no men. He was, by every law of the house, a guest, an honored one, a permanent one, but a guest, with no more right to enter the counting room at midnight than a stable boy had to sit on the king's own seat. And he had a strongbox in his arms, and he was coming out of a room he had no key to enter, and the key I held on my own hip was the only copy but the one Peveril kept, and Peveril was an old man asleep in his own bed 3 corridors away. I could have stopped him. I want you to understand that I thought about it in the half-second I had, and I decided not to. A warden's authority is real, but it is not the same as a sworn man's. I could keep a door, but to lay hands on the Queen Consort's own son at midnight, on nothing more than a strongbox and a bad feeling, would have been a thing I could not have made stand in the light of morning. He would have said he had leave. His mother would have said she gave it. And I, an old key holder with no proof, would have been the man who assaulted a lord in the dark, and my 40 years would have counted for nothing against the word of the Queen Consort. So I let him pass. I stood in the shadow of the arch and let him carry his box down the corridor toward the guest wing, and I marked the hour, and I marked the room, and I told myself that the next morning I would find out, quietly and lawfully, what had been taken out of the counting room in the night. That was the thread. It did not look like much. A box, a lord, a locked room, but I had kept the doors of that house long enough to know that the great crimes of a palace are never dramatic in the doing. They are dull. They are a clerk's stroke of the pen, a seal pressed to the wrong warrant, a coin moved from the column where it belongs to the column where it will not be missed until the year's accounting. The drama comes later at the feast in the great hall when the dull thing is finally read aloud and the realm is stunned. The wrong itself is always quiet. It has to be. A loud wrong gets caught. I went to Peveril at dawn. I found the old clerk already at his desk in the counting room, and I will tell you that the moment I stepped through the door I knew he knew something was wrong, because he looked up at me the way a man looks up who has been dreading a knock. Peveril was not a brave man. Brave men do not last 20 years keeping another person's secrets in ink. But he was an honest one, in the narrow, frightened way of a man who has spent his life balancing columns, and I had known him long enough to know how to speak to him. "Peveril," I said, and I set the household keys on his desk between us, which is a thing a warden does to say we are both the king's men here. "I walked the round last night." He said nothing. His pen had stopped. "There was a light in this room at midnight," I said, "and a man came out of it with a strongbox. A man who does not hold the key to this room and did not have it from me, and cannot have had it from you because you were abed. So I would like you to tell me, as one of the king's servants to another, what is in that box, and by whose leave it left this room." The old clerk put down his pen. His hands were shaking. And then he did a thing that told me the wrong was larger than a single box of coin, because a small wrong does not make an old man look the way Peveril looked. He got up and he went to the door, and he looked out into the corridor to be sure no one was near, and he closed it, and he came back, and he sat down, and he said in a voice I had to lean in to hear, "Warden, if I tell you and it is known that I told you, I am a dead man in this house, not killed, not so crude as that, but turned out disgraced, my name put about as a thief, my pension gone, my daughter's marriage broken. That is how it is done here now. So before I say a word I must know, are you the king's man truly, or are you hers? I have been asked a great many questions in my life. That is the one I am proudest of my answer to. I have kept the doors of this house for the king, and for the house itself for 40 years, I told him. I served the late Queen Isolde, God keep her, and I have served every soul who lived honestly under this roof since, high and low. I am not the Queen Consort's man. I am not the Crown Prince's man. I am the king's man and the house's man, and if there is a rot in the ledgers of this house, I will pull it out and I will keep your name clean while I do it, on my oath as a warden of the keys. Now, tell me what is in the box." Peveril looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into the drawer of his desk, and he took out a second ledger, not the great bound book that sat on the reading stand for anyone to see, but a smaller one, a private one, The kind and honest clerk keeps in secret when he can no longer trust the official one. And he laid it on the desk and opened it. And he turned it so the columns faced me. And he put one shaking finger on a line and he said, "It is not what is in the box, Warden. It is where the box has been going. Look." And I looked, and I began, that gray dawn, to understand what I had walked into. I am not a clerk. I will not pretend to you that I understood the whole of Peveril's private ledger in one reading, or that I could have stood before the council of the realm that morning and named the crime in the language of accounts. But a man who keeps the doors of a house learns the shape of money, the way a shepherd learns the shape of weather, and I understood enough. I understood it the way you understand a wound before you understand the blade that made it. The consort's charge, Peveril explained to me in that low, frightened voice, drew money from three great sources. There was the household provisioning fund, which paid for the running of the palace, the food, the fuel, the linens, the endless small costs of keeping 400 people housed and fed. There was the roll of the household's pay, which was the wages of every servant and clerk and stable hand under the roof. And there was the charge of the royal charities, the alms the house gave in the king's name to the founding hospitals, the orphan houses, the winter doles for the poor of the near counties, which under the late Queen Isolde had been the pride of Harrowgate and the reason the common people had loved her. For years, Peveril said, the consort's charge had run as it always had. Morwenna had held it since 3 years into her marriage, and though she kept a harder hand on it than Isolde had, she cut the charities a little, raised the state feasts a great deal, spent more on the household show and less on its comfort. It had all been within the bounds of what a consort might do. A queen may spend the king's money as she thinks best. That is what the charge is for. But something had changed, Peveril said, about 18 months before. The change had come, he was almost sure, when Lord Cassius's debts had come due. For Cassius, it turned out, was a gambler. Not the kind who plays for coppers of an evening, the kind who plays for the deeds of estates, who signs notes to hard men in far cities, who wakes one morning owing more than the income of a county and no way on earth to pay it. His own inheritance from his father was long since drunk and diced away. He had come to Harrowgate a guest and a debtor, and he had stayed a guest and a debtor. And for years his mother had covered his losses out of her own private purse, quietly, the way a mother does. But 18 months before, the debts had grown past anything a private purse could cover. Men had begun to come to the palace gates asking for Lord Cassius. Hard men. The kind a proud woman like Morwenna could not bear to have seen at her door. And so Peveril's finger moved down the columns as he spoke, and I watched the crime take shape in ink. The Queen Consort had begun to take the money from the charge. It was cleverly done. I will not deny her that, though it sickens me still. She did not simply steal it. A plain theft would have shown at once in the great official ledger, the one anyone might read. Instead, she used the charge's own machinery against itself. The provisioning fund was billed for goods that were never delivered, feasts that were smaller than the accounts claimed, deliveries of wine and cloth and candle that existed only on paper, paid to merchants who were Cassius's creditors under other names. The roll of the household's pay carried the names of servants who had left the house years before, or who had never existed at all, whose wages were drawn each quarter and vanished. And the charities, this was the part that put the iron in me, the part I have never forgiven. The charities had been quietly, steadily starved. The winter dole to the poor of the near counties, which the late Queen had set at a sum that fed 1,000 families through the cold months, had been cut by more than half over 18 months, and the difference, coin given in the king's own name to the poor, had been moved, through Peveril's helpless pen, into the dark. How much? I asked him. My voice, I remember, was very quiet. He told me. I will not repeat the number here, because a number on a page means nothing to a man who has not stood in the counting room and felt the weight of it. I will only say that it was enough to buy a small county outright, and that most of it had been carried, box by box, at midnight, Out the door I had watched Cassius come through, to the hard men at the gates, to keep a gambler's throat uncut. "And the king does not know," I said. "The king," said Peveril, and there was a world of old grief in the way he said it, "does not read the ledgers, Warden. He has not read them since the late queen died. She read them, he trusted her, and when she died he handed the reading to the new queen and never took it back. That is how it is done. The king trusts his consort with the ledgers, and the council trusts the king, and no one reads the book but the clerk who keeps it, and the clerk who keeps it does as the consort bids him, or he is turned out into the road. That is the whole of it. There is no dragon guarding this treasure, Warden. There is only an old man's trust and an old man's fear and me." I have thought a great deal in the years since about what Peveril said to me that morning. There is no dragon guarding the treasure. It is the truest thing anyone ever told me about the running of a great house, and about the running of a realm, and I think about the running of the world. The strong things, the walls, the guards, the sworn oaths, all face outward, toward the enemy who comes to the gate. It is the inside that is soft. It is trust that is soft, and a clever hand that already lives inside the walls, that already holds the trust, does not need to break down any door. It needs only to pick up the pen. "Why," I asked him, "are you telling me this? You have kept it 18 months. You could have kept it 18 years. What broke you?" And here the old clerk's face did something I had not expected. It crumpled, the way a strong old paper crumples when it is finally bent past its grain, and he put his hand over his eyes and he said, "Because last month she made me do a thing I cannot bear. She made me forge a warrant." I went very still. A false ledger entry is a great crime. But a warrant, a formal writ under the household seal, a document meant to carry the force of the king's own will. A forged warrant is a crime against the crown itself, the kind of crime for which a man does not lose his pension but his head. "What warrant?" I said. Peveril took his hand from his eyes. "You must understand," he said, "that she is not merely stealing to pay her son's debts. That is the smaller thing. She has seen she is not a fool, Warden. She has seen that the debts will never end, that Cassius will gamble away a county a year for the rest of his life, and that sooner or later the theft will grow too large to hide, and someone will read the book, and the whole thing will come down. So she has begun to prepare a place to stand when it comes down. She has begun to build herself a power that the reckoning cannot touch." "How?" I said. "She is the consort. When the king dies she is a dowager. The crown prince inherits everything. She has no ground to stand on." "She has," said Peveril, "if there is a warrant that says she does. And there is now, because I made it. A warrant of regency, drawn up, sealed with the household seal, and dated, Warden, hear me, dated to be signed by the king when his health next fails him. It names the Queen Consort Morwenna as regent of the realm in the event of the king's incapacity, with full power over the crown and the household in the person of the young heirs, until such time as the crown prince is judged fit to rule. And there is a clause, I wrote it, God forgive me, a clause that gives the regent the sole power to judge when the prince is fit, which is to say, never. It is a document that would make her queen in all but name for the rest of her life, and put the crown prince and his children under her hand, and it wants only one thing to make it law." "The king's signature," I said. "The king's signature," said Peveril, "on a day when he is too ill or too weary or too grieved to read what he is signing. And he signs a great many things I put before him, Warden, because he trusts the consort's clerk. That is my office. I carry the household writs to the king and he signs them. He signed 40 of them last month without reading 3. The old man's voice dropped to almost nothing. "The warrant is in the strongbox, the one you saw. Cassius carries it back and forth to hide it from the other clerks. He thinks I do not know he cannot read the half of it. It is waiting. It wants only the king to have a bad enough day. And the king is old, Warden, and the winter is coming, and he has bad days now more often than good ones. So you see why I could not carry it any longer alone." I sat with that a long moment in the gray light of the counting room, with the household keys cold on the desk between us and the whole quiet, rotten architecture of the thing laid open in front of me. And I understood, at last, the true size of what I had walked into when I stepped back into the shadow of the plateroom arch 3 corridors and 1 night before. It was not a theft. A theft I could have carried to a magistrate. It was a slow, patient, bloodless coup, being built one forged line at a time inside the trust of a dying king, and it was very nearly finished, and there was no dragon guarding it, only an old key holder and an old clerk, and whatever we two could do before the king had his bad day. "Peveril," I said, "does anyone else know anyone at all?" He shook his head. "No living soul but you and me, and her and Cassius and the daughter Verena, who I think suspects but does not act," and he stopped. "And," I said. "And I think," said Peveril slowly, "the Crown Prince suspects that something is wrong. Not this. He does not know this. But he has been asking questions this half-year, quiet ones, careful ones, the way his mother, the late Queen, used to ask them. He came to me a month ago and asked to see the charity's accounts, and the old man's shame broke over his face again. I showed him the false book, Warden, the clean one. I lied to the prince's face because I was afraid, but he did not believe me. I could see it. He thanked me and he left, and he has been watching ever since. He is Isolde's son. He knows the smell of a wrong even when he cannot name it. If there is any hope in this house, Warden, it is him." And that was the first time it came to me, the thought that would grow, over the 3 weeks between that dawn and that feast, into the strange and quiet campaign that ended in the great hall with the whole realm stunned. If there is any hope in this house, it is him, not the king, who was too old and too trusting and too tired to read his own doom. Not the council, who would not move against the consort on the word of a warden and a frightened clerk. But the Crown Prince, Isolde's son, honorable, patient, already half awake to the rot, if he could be brought the proof, and brought it in a way that could not be denied or buried or turned back on the men who carried it. That was the task. And I, an old man whose whole office was the keeping of doors, set about it the only way I knew how. Quietly, lawfully, 1 door at a time. The first thing I did was nothing. I know how that sounds, but a man in a house that has turned rotten learns that the first mistake is to move too soon, and I had watched too many hasty men break themselves against the Queen Consort's patience to make that mistake myself. If I had gone that same morning to the Crown Prince and told him what Peveril had told me, I would have brought him a story and no proof. A warden's word, and a frightened clerk's whisper against the consort's 20 years of clean official ledgers and her rank and her influence over half the council. Rowan might have believed me, but belief is not enough to unseat a consort. What he would have needed, to move at all, was proof that could stand in the light, the forged warrant itself, in his own hand, and the private ledger that showed the theft, and a lawful reason to have taken them that no one could turn into a charge of treason against the men who carried them. So I did nothing that anyone could see, and a great deal that no one could. I began over the following days to do my rounds more thoroughly, and to keep, in my own careful hand, a warden's record of what I found. This was entirely within my office. A warden of the keys is charged with the security of the doors and the boxes of the household, and it is not merely his right but his duty to note when a locked room has been entered out of hours, when a strongbox has been moved without a writ, when the roll of keys does not match the roll of who has been where. I had let the first night pass without a record. I did not let the next one pass. When Cassius carried the strongbox back to the counting room 2 nights later, Peveril warned me it was coming, for the false accounts needed the box's papers to make the quarter's entries. I was in the shadow of the plateroom arch again, and this time I made a record. The hour, the man, the room, the box, the fact that no writ of mine had authorized the entry. I did it 3 more times over 2 weeks. 4 entries in a warden's own official daybook, each of them true, each of them dull, each of them nothing but the honest noting of an irregularity in the doors I was sworn to keep. That daybook was my first weapon. It proved nothing about the theft, but it proved, in my own lawful hand and under my own lawful office, that Lord Cassius had entered a sealed household room out of hours, 4 times, carrying a strongbox without authority. And an entry into a sealed room without authority is a thing a warden may lawfully act upon. It gave me the one thing I had lacked in the shadow of the arch that first night, a lawful reason on the record to open that box. The second thing I did was harder, because it meant trusting a man I was not sure I could trust. I have said that the sworn men guard the king's body. Not I, but the captain of the sworn men that year was a hard, plain soldier named Sir Bregan, a man I had known 30 years, who had come up through the ranks with me when we were both young enough to think the world was simple. Bregan was not clever. He would have been the first to tell you so. But he was honest all the way through, the way a good beam is honest, and he had loved the late Queen Isolde, and he had never troubled to hide that he had no love for the new one. If I was to open a strongbox belonging to the Queen Consort's son, I would need a sworn man beside me to make it lawful and safe, a witness of rank, whose word the council would take, who could not be turned out of the house by the consort's displeasure the way a warden or a clerk could. I went to Bregan on the 9th night in the guardroom, over the bad wine the sworn men drank, and I told him, not everything, but enough. I told him I had reason to believe a sealed household room had been entered without authority 4 times by Lord Cassius, and that I meant to open the box he carried, and that I wanted a sworn man of rank at my side when I did it, so that whatever we found could not be called a lie or a theft of our own. Bregan listened with his big scarred hands around his cup, and when I had finished, he was quiet a long moment, and then he said only, "Isolde's charities, the winter dole. My own mother had bread from that dole when I was a boy, Fenwick. If someone has been thieving the poor's bread to pay a card debt, I will open 10 boxes. And then, because he was not a clever man, but he was not a stupid one either, he added, "But we do it right. We do it by the book, or she'll have both our heads and call it justice. What is your lawful ground?" I showed him the day book. He read the 4 entries slowly, moving his lips, and when he had finished he closed it and set it down and said, "That'll serve. A sealed room entered without a writ. You're the warden. It's your box to open by right of your office, and I'll stand witness as captain of the sworn men." "When?" "Not yet," I said. "There is a piece missing still, and if we move before we have it, we lose everything." The piece that was missing was the crown prince. For here was the trap I had to think my way around, and it took me the better part of a week of sleepless nights to see the shape of it. Suppose Bregan and I opened the box. Suppose we found the forged Warrant of Regency and the box of stolen coin and everything Peveril had described. What then? We could not take it to the king. The king would take it to the consort, because that was his habit of 40 years, to lay every trouble in his wife's lap, and she would explain it away and destroy the evidence and destroy us. We could not take it to the council. Half the council owed her favors and the other half feared her, and a warden and a soldier accusing the Queen Consort of treason would be, at best, disbelieved and at worst, silenced. We could take it to no court in the realm, for the consort's rank stood above every court but the king's own. There was exactly one person in Harrowgate with the standing to act on the proof, and the honesty to want to, the Crown Prince Rowan. He alone outranked the consort in the order of the house. He alone, as heir, had the lawful power to demand an accounting of the household in the king's name if the king's own health failed. He alone was already awake to the wrong and already trusted by the council and the guard and the people. If I could put the proof into Rowan's hands, cleanly, lawfully, in a way that made him the man who uncovered it, and not merely the man who received a whisper, then the whole rotten structure would have, at last, a hand strong enough to pull it down. But I could not simply go to the prince and tell him. If I did, and it went wrong, if the consort learned that the warden of the keys had been carrying tales to her stepson, then I would have handed her the very weapon she needed. She would say the crown prince, her rival, her dead predecessor's son, had suborned the household staff to fabricate charges against her, to seize her lawful place, to poison the king's mind against his own wife. It is an old, ugly move, and it works, because it is exactly the sort of thing a rival heir might do, and the council would half believe it, and the king in his weariness would half believe it, and the proof would be tainted before it was ever weighed. The prince had to come to the truth in a way that could never be called a scheme of his own. He had to be led to open the door himself. So I did the third thing, and it was the most careful thing I have ever done in my life. I did not go to the crown prince. I let the crown prince come to me. He had been asking questions all that half year. Peveril had said, quiet ones, careful ones, about the charities, about the accounts. A man who is asking questions can be answered without ever being told. And a warden of the keys, whose whole office is to know which door is open to which hand, is exactly the sort of man a careful heir would eventually come to ask a careful question of. All I had to do was be findable and be ready, and when the question came, answer it not with the truth, which would have tainted everything, but with a door. The crown prince came to me 11 days before the feast, in the cold hour after the evening meal, when I was making my early round of the western wing. He came alone, which a crown prince almost never does, and he fell into step beside me in the corridor as naturally as if we had walked it together every night of our lives, and for a while he said nothing at all, and neither did I, because I had learned long since that Rowan of Harrowgate used silence the way his mother had, as a room to let a man walk into on his own feet. Then he said, "You keep a good round, Warden. My mother used to say the state of a house could be read in the state of its locks. She trusted you with them, I think, more than she trusted most of her lords." "The late queen honored me beyond my worth, Highness," I said. "I keep the round because a man who lets younger hands do all his walking forgets the shape of his own house." "Yes," said the prince. And then, after a dozen steps, "And what shape is the house in these days, Warden? You would know before any of us." There it was, the careful question, laid down like a coin on a table for me to pick up or leave lying. And here is the thing I had thought about through all those sleepless nights. I did not pick it up. I did not say, "Highness, your stepmother is robbing the poor and forging a warrant to make herself regent." If I had said that, I would have become the source of the accusation, and the accusation would have become mine, and mine would have become the crown prince's, and the whole of it would have been a scheme of the heir against the consort, exactly as she would have painted it. Instead, I gave him a door. "The house is well locked, Highness," I said. "Every door I keep is sound, but a warden keeps the doors, not what is behind them. I keep the counting room locked. I do not keep the ledgers. That is the clerk's charge and the consort's. If a man wished to know the true shape of this house, he would not ask the warden of the keys. He would ask to read the accounts himself, not the fair copy on the reading stand that any lord may see, but the working ledgers in the counting room, with the clerk beside him to answer for every line. That is his right, if he has the rank to claim it, and there are few in this house with the rank to claim it." I did not look at him when I said it. I kept my eyes forward, the way a guard keeps his eyes forward, and I let the words lie in the cold air between us. I had told him nothing that was not true and nothing that was not his own to know. I had not accused a soul. I had only pointed, as a warden may lawfully point, at a door, and named, without naming it, the single lawful key that would open it, the rank of the heir, demanding to read the accounts himself, with the clerk beside him. Rowan walked another dozen steps in silence. Then he said, very quietly, "The clerk showed me the charities book a month past. He swore it whole. I did not believe him, and I could not say why." "Peveril is an honest man, Highness," I said, "in the narrow way of a frightened one. He showed you the book he was told to show." There is only one way to know which book a clerk keeps in his heart and which he keeps in his drawer, and that is to stand over his shoulder while he opens both, with a witness of rank beside you whom no displeasure in this house can turn out, and read every line yourself. A warden might witness such a reading. So might a captain of the sworn men. He stopped walking. We had come to the head of the service stair, where the watch lamp threw our two shadows long up the wall, and he turned and looked at me full, and I met his eyes, and there was a long moment in which I understood that he understood not the details, not yet, but the shape of it, and the shape of what I was offering, and the reason I was offering it in this crabwise, careful, doorway fashion instead of plainly. "You are a subtle man, Warden Fenwick," he said at last. "I am an old one, Highness," I said. "I have watched what happens to men who move plainly against the powerful in this house. I would rather be subtle and living, and of some use to the king than plain and turned out and of use to no one." Something eased in his face then, the ghost of his mother's rare smile. "My mother said that too near the end," he said, "that there were two ways to be right in a court, loud and gone or quiet and standing. She was quiet and standing to the last day of her life." He drew a breath. "I will claim my right to read the accounts, Warden, as the heir in the king's name, with you to witness the doors and Sir Bregan to witness the reading." "When?" "3 nights hence," I said. "There is a thing you should see with your own eyes before you read a single line, so that you know what you are reading and why. Come to the Western Service corridor at the midnight watch and stand where I stand and say nothing. Then in the morning claim your right and read. And Highness," I paused because this was the hinge of it, the thing that mattered most, "when you claim it loudly. Claim it before the household in the open, as the heir exercising his lawful right to know the state of his father's house. Do not creep to it. If this is done in a corner, it can be called a corner scheme. If it is done in the open, in the light, by right, it cannot. Let the whole house see the crown prince walk into the counting room in daylight and ask to read the king's accounts. That is not a scheme. That is a prince doing his duty. Make it impossible to call it anything else." He looked at me a long moment more. Then he inclined his head, the crown prince of the realm inclining his head to the warden of the keys, a thing I have never forgotten, and he said, "You have kept more than doors in this house, Fenwick. I begin to think you have kept its conscience. 3 nights hence." And he went up the stair into the dark, and I finished my round with my heart going like a young man's, because the thing was in motion now, and there was no calling it back. The night I brought the crown prince to the shadow of the plateroom arch was the coldest of that autumn, and it is burned into me forever, because it was the night the whole matter stopped being a story I had been told, and became a thing I had seen a king's son see. We stood in the dark, the prince and I, in the arch where I had stood alone 3 times, and we waited, and I prayed to whatever keeps watch over honest men that Cassius would come, because if he did not, if this was one of the nights the box stayed put, then I had brought the air out into the cold for nothing and shown my hand for nothing. But Peveril had said the quarter's false accounts were due, and the box's papers were needed to make them, and the old clerk's fear had made him a fine reader of the consort's calendar. So we waited, and a little after the midnight bell, the light bloomed under the counting-room door, and the door opened, and Lord Cassius came out into the corridor with the iron strongbox in his arms, and his soft, handsome face slack with the particular carelessness of a man who has done a wrong thing, so many times he no longer feels its weight. I felt the crown prince go still beside me. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Cassius, the way a guard keeps his eyes on the danger, and I let Rowan watch his stepmother's son carry a sealed strongbox out of a locked household room at midnight, with no writ, no leave, no lawful cause that any honest man could name, and I let him draw, in his own mind, in his own honest heart, the only conclusion an honest man could draw. When Cassius had gone down the corridor toward the guest wing and the last of his footfalls had died, the prince let out a long, slow breath, and he said, so quietly I felt it more than heard it, "How long?" 18 months, Highness, I said, by the reckoning of the man who keeps the true book, and it is not the theft that should keep you awake. The theft is the smaller thing. In the morning read the ledgers and ask the clerk what else has been made under the household seal this past year. Ask him about a warrant. Then you will know why I brought you here in the cold and why this must be done in the open and why it must be done soon. I let that sit. "The king is old, Highness, and the winter is coming." He understood me. I saw it land. And whatever softness had been in Rowan of Harrowgate's face when he spoke of his mother's smile went out of it then, and was replaced by something I had not seen in that house since Isolde herself walked its halls: the cold, level, terrible calm of a person who has just understood exactly how much is at stake and exactly how little time there is to save it. It is a frightening thing to see in a gentle man. It was the most reassuring thing I had seen in 9 years. "In the morning," he said, "in daylight, in the open." As you said. And then he did a thing that told me the whole matter had changed hands, that it was no longer my careful, crab-wise old man's campaign but the Crown Prince's own. He put his hand on my shoulder, once, the way a commander touches a soldier he is about to send into a hard place, and he said, "Thank you, Warden. Whatever comes of this, you did right. Now let me carry it. It is mine to carry now." And it was. From that night it was his. The Crown Prince claimed his right the very next morning, and he claimed it exactly as I had asked him to, in the open, in daylight, before the household, so that no man alive could ever call it a thing done in a corner. He did not send a message. He did not summon Peveril to his private rooms where a meeting might be denied or twisted. He walked, at the hour when the western wing was full of servants at their morning work, from his own apartments to the counting room, with Sir Bregan, the captain of the sworn men, at his right hand and me at his left, past the linen maids and the plate clerks and the understewards, all of whom stopped what they were doing to watch the heir of the realm pass by, with the 2 gray-headed old officers of the house at his sides. And at the door of the counting room he stopped, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry, "Warden Fenwick, unlock this room. I am the king's heir, and I exercise my lawful right to examine the accounts of my father's household. Let it be seen that I do so openly, at mid-morning, before witnesses, and that I take nothing and hide nothing." I unlocked the door, and the whole western wing saw me do it. Inside, old Peveril rose from his desk white to the lips, for he had not been warned. I had not dared warn him, lest his fear undo him. And for one terrible moment I thought the old clerk might faint, or lie, or throw himself on the prince's mercy and ruin the careful lawful shape of the thing. But Rowan crossed to him and said, gently, so gently, "Peveril, I'm not here for you. I know whose hand held the pen and whose will held the hand. I ask only that you now do, in the light, what you have long wished you could do, open both your books, and read me every line true. Do that, and you have my word before Sir Bregan and the Warden that no harm comes to you or yours. You have carried this alone long enough." And the old man broke, but he broke the right way, not into ruin, but into relief so total it was almost terrible to watch. He wept once hard, and then he wiped his face and he reached into the locked drawer of his desk and took out the second ledger, the true one, and he laid it beside the false one on the reading stand. And he began to read the 2 of them against each other, line by line, for the Crown Prince, with Sir Bregan writing down every discrepancy in his own soldier's hand, and me standing witness at the door. It took the whole of that day and half the night. I will not walk you through every line, for I have already told you the shape of the crime, and the lines only filled in its weight. But I will tell you that I watched Rowan of Harrowgate's face over those hours, and I watched it change, and I will remember the change until I die. When Peveril read him the false provisioning bills, the feasts smaller than the accounts, the deliveries that never came, the prince's jaw set. When Peveril read him the roll of the household's pay and named the ghost servants, the men and women drawing wages who had died or left or never lived, the prince's hands closed slowly on the edge of the reading stand. But when Peveril came to the charities, when he laid the 2 books side by side and showed how the winter dole to the poor of the near counties had been set by the late Queen Isolde at a sum that fed 1,000 families, and had been cut, quarter by quarter, to feed a card debt, so that in the coldest of the past 2 winters there had been families in the near counties who went to the founding hospitals and were turned away because the alms in the king's name had been quietly bled dry. Rowan put his hand over his eyes. exactly as the old clerk had done, and he was silent a long time. And when he took his hand away his eyes were dry, but there was something in them that had not been there before, something that I can only call the end of a son's patience, and he said quietly, "My mother built that dole with her own hands. She used to ride out herself to see it given in the worst weather, because she said a charity you never look upon is a charity you soon starve, and they have starved it to pay a gambler." He drew a breath. "Read me the warrant, Peveril, the one you spoke of. Let me see the whole of it." And Peveril told him then that the warrant was not in the counting room, that it was kept in the strongbox, which Cassius carried between the guest wing and the counting room, and which was, that day, in the guest wing. Here is where a lesser man would have blundered. Here is where hot blood would have sent the crown prince striding to the guest wing to seize the box by main force, and where the consort, who I promise you had eyes and ears in every corridor of that house, would have been given exactly the opening she needed. For if the heir had gone with soldiers to break into a lord's rooms and seize a locked box, then Morwenna could have stood before the king and the council, and cried out that the crown prince had assaulted her son, ransacked his chambers, and produced, from a box he had himself broken open, out of sight of any impartial witness, a warrant that she would swear he had forged himself to destroy her. Proof taken in the dark by an angry rival is not proof. It is a weapon that can be turned in the hand of the man who holds it. I had spent 3 weeks teaching myself that lesson, and now, God be thanked, the prince had learned it too. "No," said Rowan when Sir Bregan half rose. "Not like that. If I break into his rooms, she wins. The box must be opened in the open by lawful right before witnesses she cannot dismiss." He turned to me. "Warden, you have a daybook that records 4 unlawful entries into a sealed household room. By your office, does that give you the right to seize and open the box that made those entries?" "It does, Highness," I said. "A warden of the keys may seize and examine any container that has passed unlawfully through a sealed household door to determine what security of the house has been breached. I may do it on my own authority in my own office, needing no man's leave, and I may do it before whatever witnesses I choose." "Then do it tomorrow," said the prince. "In daylight. Summon the box to the counting room by lawful writ, a warden's writ, not mine, so that it is your office and not my rank that opens it. Have Sir Bregan witness as captain of the sworn men. Have 2 members of the council I can trust witness besides. I will name them, and they are men even she cannot call my creatures. And let it be opened here in this room in the light before all of them. If the warrant is in it, then it is the warden of the keys who found it, in the lawful course of his duty, before witnesses of every faction, and there is no man in the realm who can call that a scheme of mine. Can you do this, Fenwick?" "I can, Highness," I said, and my old heart was full, because I saw then that the thing I had begun 3 weeks before in the shadow of an arch had grown into something better and stronger than I had dared hope. A lawful, open, patient closing of the trap, built so carefully that when it shut, it would shut on the guilty alone and leave the innocent untouched and the honest unstained. That is the only kind of justice worth the name. The other kind, the fast kind, the dark kind, the kind that takes its proof by force and hopes no one asks how, is only vengeance wearing justice's coat, and it has undone more good men than all the villains in the world. But I have called this beat a false dawn, and I owe you the reason, for it very nearly was. That night, the night before the box was to be opened, the Queen Consort moved. I told you she had eyes and ears in every corridor, and she had, and by that evening she knew, if not the whole of it, then enough, that the crown prince had read the true ledgers, that the warden and the captain of the sworn men stood with him, that her clerk had turned. And she did the thing a cornered, clever creature does. She did not flee. She did not confess. She struck first, at the one soft place we had left uncovered, the king. She went to King Alaric that night, in his private apartments, and she wept. I know what was said because a sworn man stood the door, and sworn men, though they do not speak of what they hear, will tell their captain when the safety of the realm is in question, and Sir Bregan told me. She told the king that his son had turned against her. She told him that Rowan, the heir, had for months been suborning the household staff, the clerk, the warden, even the captain of his own sworn men, building a false case against her, forging ledgers, planning to accuse her of crimes she had never committed, all so that he might strip her of her rightful place and cast her and her children out of the house before the king was even cold. She told him that the son of his first wife had never accepted his second marriage, had never forgiven him, and now, seeing the king grown old, meant to seize the whole of the consort's charge for himself and rule the household as a tyrant while the king yet lived. She wept, and she was very beautiful in her weeping, and she was frightened, which made her more persuasive than any lie, because the fear was real. She was fighting for her life, and a creature fighting for its life is the most convincing thing on earth. And the king, old, tired, half-broken by 9 years of grief and groan, so used to laying every trouble in his wife's lap that he had forgotten how to weigh a trouble himself. The king wavered. That was the false dawn's shadow. That was the moment it might all have come to nothing. For the king, wavering, did a thing that seemed to Morwenna a masterstroke and was very nearly won. He summoned the whole court to the great hall the next day. The feast of the founding fell the very next morning, you see. The court was already assembling, and he let it be known that he would hear the matter of the household accounts before the assembled realm, and that both his wife and his son would stand before him, and that he would judge between them. The consort thought she had won. Do you see why? She had taken the matter out of the counting room, out of the reach of Peveril's ledgers and the warden's day book and Sir Bregan's careful list of discrepancies, and put it into the great hall, where the weapons were not ledgers but words, and there was no better weaver of words in that house than she. In the counting room, before impartial witnesses, the truth would have crushed her. In the great hall, before a court she had spent 7 years cultivating, with an old king wavering on his seat and her own beautiful grief on full display, she believed she could turn the whole thing into a matter of a son's ambition against a wife's tears, and win it the way she had won everything in that house, by being the most convincing voice in the room. And she had one more card which she did not know we knew, the strongbox. Sometime in that same night, she sent to Cassius to take the strongbox, with the forged warrant of Regency inside it, and burn everything in it, and scatter the ashes, so that, when the morning came and the warden demanded to open the box, there would be nothing in it but coin, and the whole grave charge of the forged warrant would collapse into a warden's fever dream, and she could point to its collapse as proof that the entire case was invented. Here is where the story turned, and here is where I must give the credit to men other than myself, because a warden's careful web is only as good as the honest hands that hold its threads, and that night 3 honest hands held fast. The first was Peveril's. The old clerk, who had wept his relief in the counting room, went back to his desk that evening a changed man, a man who had, at long last, chosen a side, and found that the choosing had given him a courage he had not owned in 20 years. And Peveril knew the consort. He knew that a cornered Morwenna would go for the strongbox. So without being asked, on his own frightened, stubborn, honest initiative, the old clerk did the one thing that saved us all. Late that evening, before the consort's order to Cassius could be carried out, he went to the guest wing on a clerk's ordinary errand, bringing Lord Cassius the quarter's papers to sign, a thing he did every quarter, a thing that raised no alarm, and while he was in the room, under the pretense of sorting the papers into the box, he took the forged warrant out of the strongbox and slid it inside his own clerk's folio, and he carried it out under Cassius's very nose, because Cassius, God help him, could not read the half of what was in the box, and did not know one document from another. When the consort's men came in the small hours to burn the box's contents, they burned the coin tallies and the false receipts, evidence, yes, but the smaller evidence, and they never knew that the one document that could hang them all was already 3 corridors away, in an old clerk's folio, being carried to the Crown Prince. The second honest hand was Sir Bregan's. When Peveril brought the warrant to the prince's apartments near midnight, It was Bregan who understood at once what the consort's move to the great hall truly meant and what had to be done to meet it. "She's taken it to the ground she's strongest on," the old soldier said. "A talking match in front of a court she's bought half of. We can't win a talking match, but we don't have to. We have the thing itself." And he held up the forged warrant. "You don't argue with a court, Highness. You show them. You put the forged warrant in the king's own hand in front of everyone, and you let the paper do the talking. She's a fine talker, but she can't talk a warrant she forged into a warrant she didn't." And the third honest hand, the one that mattered most, the one that turned the whole thing from a defense into a justice, was the Crown Prince's own, and it came from a place none of us had expected, and it is the true heart of why the realm was left stunned the next morning. For Rowan, holding the forged Warrant of Regency in his hands at midnight, reading by candlelight the clause that named his stepmother regent with sole power to judge him forever unfit, reading the part that put his own children, Torin and Malin and little Bram, under her hand until she alone should say otherwise, Rowan did not do what a lesser heir would have done. He did not plan his stepmother's destruction. He planned the household's rescue. "Fenwick," he said to me, for I was there in his apartments in the small hours before the feast, with Bregan and Peveril and the 2 councilmen the prince trusted, "understand me. I could stand up in that hall tomorrow and destroy her. I have the warrant. I have the ledgers. I have the witnesses. I could see her stripped of everything and cast out and named a traitor, and my father would sign it because the paper leaves him no choice, and I would be within my rights every step of the way." He set the warrant down. "But if I do that, what have I taught this realm? That the way to power in Harrowgate is to catch your rival in a crime and grind them into the dust. That is her lesson. That is Cassius's lesson. That is the whole rotten lesson of a house where there is no dragon guarding the treasure, only trust, and where trust has become a thing to be exploited rather than kept. I will not win her way and call it justice." "Then what, Highness?" said Bregan, baffled, as a plain, honest soldier is baffled when a thing that ought to be simple is made complicated by conscience. "The wrong here," said Rowan slowly, working it out even as he spoke, "is not only that she stole. The wrong is that a power meant to serve the house, the consort's charge, was turned into a weapon against the house. The charge is not the crime. The charge is a good thing, a necessary thing. My mother held it and blessed the whole realm with it. The crime is the hand that held it. So the remedy is not to destroy the charge, and not to make a great bloody spectacle of destroying the woman. The remedy is to take the charge out of the corrupt hand and put it into a clean one, lawfully, openly, before the whole realm, and to do it in a way that both saves the house and shows the whole court forever after, that in Harrowgate a stolen power will be quietly, lawfully, unanswerably taken back. Not vengeance, restoration." And he looked up at us, and in his face was the whole of the plan that would leave the realm stunned the next morning, and I understood at last why he had wanted the matter kept so careful and so lawful and so open every step of the way. He was not building a case to destroy Morwenna. He was building a case so airtight, so open, so impossible to call a scheme, that when the king placed the consort's charge into his hands the next morning before the assembled realm, no one, not the council, not the ambassadors, not the wavering king himself, and not Morwenna with all her weeping and all her bought voices, could call it anything but exactly what it was: the lawful removal of a corrupt trust and the restoration of an honest one. "But the king wavers," I said. "She has been to him. He half believes her. He has called it a matter to be judged in the hall, thinking to give her the ground she wants. How do you turn the king, Highness, before the whole court, with the consort weeping at his side?" Rowan smiled, the ghost of his mother's smile again, but harder now, surer. "I do not turn the king with words, Warden," he said. "You taught me that yourself in the corridor 3 nights past. I turn him with a door. I put the warrant in his hand and I let him read it himself, the clause that names her regent, the clause that puts his own grandchildren under her hand, the seal she forged, the date she left blank for the day of his own weakness. My father is old and tired and too trusting. But he is not a fool, and he is not a coward, and he loved my mother, and he loves those children more than his own life. Let her weep all she likes. When Alaric of Harrowgate reads in his own hands the paper that would have made his grandchildren the wards of the woman who forged it, he will not need me to tell him what to do. He will only need to be shown the door. And then he will walk through it himself before the whole realm, and the realm will be stunned, and it will be just, and it will be done. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. And in the gray hour before the feast, the old warden of the keys took his ring of keys and his day book and his place at the head of the western rank, and waited for the great hall to fill, and for the chamberlain to unroll the day's proclamations, and for the third great silence of my life to fall. And now you know why the chamberlain's voice caught on the line about the consort's charge, and why I watched Morwenna's face instead of the king's, and why, when the words landed, she looked to the great arched doorway where her son stood in the shadow. She had come to that hall believing she had won, believing she had dragged the matter onto her own ground, believing that the day would be a talking match she could not lose, believing the strongbox burned and the warrant with it. She did not yet know that the proclamation Osric had just read was not the king's judgment given in her favor. It was the king's judgment already made, because in the 2 hours between the gray dawn and the noon feast, while the court assembled and gossiped and took its places, the crown prince had done exactly what he had said he would do, and it had gone exactly as he had said it would go. Let me tell you what the court did not see. Let me tell you what happened in the king's privy chamber that morning, before ever the doors of the great hall were opened, because I was there, I and Bregan and the 2 councilmen, and Peveril with his folio, and the crown prince and the king, and because she had insisted on it and none of us wished to deny her and give her a grievance, the Queen Consort Morwenna herself. Rowan did not accuse her. That is the thing I want you to understand, the thing that made it just. He did not stand before his father and cry treason and match her weeping with his outrage. He came into the privy chamber and knelt to the king, his father, and he said, "Sire, I have exercised my lawful right as your heir to examine the accounts of your household, openly, before witnesses, as the warden and the captain of the sworn men will attest. In doing so I have come upon a document that I believe you have never seen, and that I believe you must see before you sit in judgment on anything this day. I make no charge. I ask only that you read it yourself in your own hands, and then say what you will." And he gave the king the forged Warrant of Regency. I watched the king read it. I have watched a great many men read a great many terrible things, and there is a moment always when the words stop being marks on a page and become real, become a thing that has happened, and the whole face changes at once. I saw that moment come to Alaric of Harrowgate. I saw him read the clause that named his wife regent of the realm. I saw him read the clause that gave her the sole power to judge his son forever unfit to rule. And I saw him come to the clause that Peveril had wept over writing, that placed the persons of the young heirs, his own grandchildren, Torin and Malin and little Bram, under the regent's hand, until she alone should say otherwise. I saw the old king's hands begin to shake. And I saw him look at the seal, the household seal, pressed into the wax, the seal that was Morwenna's to keep. And I saw him look at the date, which was not a date at all, but a blank waiting to be filled with the day of his own weakness. He looked up, he looked at his wife, and in his old, tired, grief-worn face there was no longer any wavering at all. "Morwenna," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "did you make this?" She was magnificent, I will give her that to the last. She did not fall, she did not confess. She said, in a voice of wounded love, that she had never seen the document, that it was plainly a forgery made by those who wished to destroy her, that her stepson had hated her from the first and had at last found a way to be rid of her, that she was the victim of a cruel and ambitious plot, and she wept and reached for the king's hand. And the king looked at her hand and did not take it and said only, "The seal is yours. The clerk who keeps it is here, and will swear before God and the council whose voice ordered it made. The ledgers are here, and they are read and witnessed, and they show where the king's charity to the poor has gone these 18 months. I have not asked you whether you love me, Morwenna. I no longer know the answer, and I find I am too old to bear the asking. I have asked you whether you made this, and you have not said no. You have said everything but no. There was a silence in that privy chamber deeper than any I had known, and into it the king spoke the words that he would speak again, an hour later, through the chamberlain's mouth, to the whole assembled realm. The consort's charge, he said, is the trust I place in the one who stands nearest me, to hold the running of my house and the giving of my house's mercy in her hands as if they were my own. My first wife held it, and it was a blessing on the realm. You have held it, and you have made of it a knife, and pointed the knife at my own son and my own son's children. I do not know all that you have done. I am too old and too tired to sit in judgment on the whole of it today, and I will not turn my own hall into a slaughterhouse to satisfy a court's appetite for a spectacle. But this I can do, and this I will do, cleanly and at once. I take the charge from your hand. You have shown me you cannot be trusted with it, and a trust that cannot be trusted is no trust, but a danger. It is removed from you. And I place it, and here he looked at his son, kneeling still before him, in the hand of the Crown Prince Rowan, who exercised his lawful right openly and in the light, who brought me this paper rather than using it, who could have destroyed you before the whole realm this day and chose instead to bring the matter first to me, his father in private on his knees. That is the hand I trust. Let him hold the charge in my name until I order otherwise, which I will not. That was the judgment. It was made in the privy chamber, before the doors of the great hall ever opened, before the court ever assembled, before a single ambassador took his place. And then the king did the thing that made it stun the realm. He ordered it proclaimed. Not argued, not defended, not put to the council for a vote where Morwenna's bought voices might muddy it. Simply proclaimed, as an act already done by the king's own hand and seal, read out among the ordinary proclamations of the feast of the founding, in the flat, dry voice of the chamberlain, so that the whole realm learned of it in the same breath, and at the same moment, as a thing settled and beyond appeal. That is why the hall went so silent. That is why the ambassadors leaned to whisper. The realm heard, in one sentence read among the year's dull business, that the Queen Consort had been stripped of the consort's charge, and the Crown Prince had been given it, a thing unheard of in 400 years. And the realm did not know why, and could not know why, because the why had been settled behind a closed door by an honest man on his knees and an old king reading a forged paper in his shaking hands. All the realm saw was the mountain that had moved. It did not see the patient old warden and the frightened clerk and the plain, honest soldier who had, over 3 careful weeks, quietly rolled it. And Morwenna, standing at the left of the dais in her gown the color of old wine, looked to the great arched doorway where her son stood, for she knew, in that instant, that if the charge was gone and the king was turned, then the strongbox and its warrant were the last thing standing between her and ruin, and she was sending Cassius, with one look, to burn it at last. She did not know it was already 3 days too late. I saw the look pass. I saw Cassius receive it and turn to slip out through the arch, back toward the guest wing, to do the one thing his mother still believed could save them, destroy the box, destroy the evidence, so that when the accusation came it would rest on nothing but words. And I did the last thing I did in the whole affair, the one thing that was purely mine, that no one had planned and no one had asked. I stepped out of the western rank. A warden does not leave his place during a proclamation. It is one of the small iron laws of the house, and I had kept it for 40 years. But I had learned from the Crown Prince and from his mother before him that there are 2 ways to be right in a court, and I chose, that once, to be quiet and standing rather than still and silent. I stepped out of the rank and I crossed to the arch, and I put myself in the doorway, an old man in a red tunic, with a ring of keys at his hip, square in the path of Lord Cassius. "My lord," I said quietly, so that only he could hear. "The box you are going to burn is empty of the one thing that matters. It has been empty 3 days. There is nothing left in the guest wing for you to save. Whatever you do now, you do in front of 200 witnesses, and it will only make plainer what is already known. I have kept the doors of this house 40 years, my lord. I am keeping this one now. Go back to your place." He stared at me, and I watched the understanding come into his soft, handsome face, that it was over, that it had been over before he ever knew it had begun, that the old man in the doorway had been standing in his mother's shadow all along, and he had never once thought the key holder worth lying to. He had no words. Men like Cassius rarely do, when the softness they have lived in finally gives way. He turned, and he did not go back to his place, and he did not make a scene. He simply walked out of the great hall by the small side door, out of the feast, out, as it proved, of the house, for he was gone from Harrowgate by nightfall, and I never saw him again. Which was, in the end, the mercy the Crown Prince had intended. No arrest, no spectacle, no blockend acts. Only the quiet closing of every door until the guilty found there was nowhere left in that house to stand. I went back to my place at the head of the western rank. The proclamation went on. The feast of the founding was observed to its end, as it must be, for a realm does not stop its calendar for one family's grief. And when it was over, and the court dispersed to whisper in every corridor about the thing they had witnessed and did not understand, the true work, the quiet, lawful, patient work that was the whole point of the exercise, began. Let me tell you how it ended, thread by thread, because I promised you at the outset that I would leave none of them loose, and a warden keeps his promises the way he keeps his doors. The Queen Consort Morwenna was not cast out. That surprised the court, which had expected, after such a proclamation, to see her march to the gates in disgrace. But the Crown Prince had meant what he said about restoration over vengeance, and the king, once turned, was content to be guided by his son in the manner of it. Morwenna kept her title, for a title taken by force would have made her a martyr, and the realm did not need a martyr. It needed the thing quietly set right. She kept her rooms. She kept her rank at table. What she did not keep was the charge, or any office, or any hand on the running of the house, or any access to the counting room, the household seal, the roll of pay, or the charities, all of which now flowed through the Crown Prince, who administered them in his mother's memory with a plain, honest hand and an open book. Morwenna became, in a single morning, what she had schemed her whole time in Harrowgate to never become, a consort in name, honored in form, and utterly without power. It was, I think, a harder punishment than exile would have been, for a woman of her pride. She lived out her years in that gilded emptiness, and she never once, to my knowledge, admitted a single thing she had done, and I have come to believe she died believing herself the wronged party, which is the particular hell that clever, selfish people build for themselves, and then cannot understand why no one else will live in it with them. Lord Cassius, gone from the house by nightfall, was pursued by his creditors to the ends of the realm and beyond it, and the last I heard of him he was living small and mean in a far city, still gambling, still owing, a soft man grown old in the ruin he had made. His debts, once his mother's purse and the realm's charities could no longer feed them, were his own at last. There is a kind of justice in that which is quieter and more complete than any blockhand acts. He was simply left to be exactly what he had always been, with none of the king's coin to hide it any longer. Old Peveril kept his post, and his pension and his name, and his daughter's marriage, exactly as the Crown Prince had sworn he would. More than that, Rowan made him the keeper of the true and only ledger of the household, with 2 junior clerks under him, and a standing order that the accounts be read aloud, once each quarter, before the warden and the captain of the sworn men and a member of the council, so that never again in that house could a single hand hold the whole secret of the money in the dark. The old man lived several years more, and I am told he walked those last years like a man who had set down a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it was heavy, and that he wept, once, at the first quarter's public reading, when the charities were named, and the winter dole was read out, restored, and more than restored, for the crown prince set it higher than even his mother Isolde had, and wrote out himself in the first hard whether to see it given, exactly as she once had. There is no dragon guarding the treasure, Peveril had told me. But there was from that day a prince who read the ledger in a room full of honest witnesses, which is a better guard than any dragon, for a dragon can be bought or slain, and an honest reading, done in the open, cannot. Sir Bregan I served beside another 6 years, until his knees gave out and mine did too, and we retired within a season of each other, and he lived to be very old, and to the end of his days he told the story of the winter dole and the card debt to anyone who would sit still for it, always ending it the same way. And the prince could have had her head, had the paper for it, had the right, and he chose to save the house instead of destroying the woman. That's the difference, lad, between a strong man and a good one. A strong man wins. A good one wins right. I never once corrected him for the parts he got wrong. A story that teaches the right thing is truer than a story that gets every fact straight, and Bregan taught the right thing. And the crown prince. I have saved him for last, because he is the reason there was ever a story worth the telling. Rowan of Harrowgate held the consort's charge for the rest of his father's reign, and he held it as his mother had held it, as a trust, not a weapon, as a thing spent on the house and the poor and the running of the realm, never on himself. The court, which had been stunned by the proclamation, came in time to understand the why of it, for the truth of such things always seeps out through the servants' corridors in the end, and when the court understood, its stun turned to something better. It became the settled understanding of the realm that in Harrowgate there was an heir who, given a weapon that could have destroyed his rival and every reason to use it, had chosen instead to restore what was stolen and spare what he could, and that there was, standing behind him, an institution of quiet men, a warden, a clerk, a captain, a guard who could not be bought and would not be moved, and who kept the trust of the house even when the house's own queen had forgotten what trust was for. When old King Alaric died at last, some years later in his bed, in the winter with his son's hand in his, he had a good death in the end and a quiet one, and I stood the door of his chamber for the last of it. The realm passed to Rowan without a tremor, without a rival, without a single voice raised against him, because there was no longer any question in any corner of the realm about the quality of the hand that would hold the crown. The scheme that was meant to make Morwen a regent and put the crown prince and his children under her hand had done, in its failure, the precise opposite of what she intended. It had shown the whole realm, in the clearest possible light, exactly who Rowan of Harrowgate was, and exactly why the crown belonged in his keeping. There is a justice in that too, the deepest kind, the kind that turns a villain's own weapon into the making of the thing she most feared. I am very old now. I keep no doors any longer. Younger men keep them and keep them well, and I have taught the best of them the one thing that matters, which is not how to hold a key but how to know a wrong when the house is asleep, and no one else has seen it yet. I sit by the fire and I turn the old winter over in my hands, and I think about that third great silence, the one that fell in the great hall when the realm was stunned, and I think about what the realm never knew. The realm thought it had witnessed a marvel that morning, a crown prince unexpectedly, unprecedentedly, taking up the Queen Consort's own role, a mountain moved by the king's sudden inexplicable hand. And it had. But a marvel is only the visible top of a thing, the part that shows above the water. The realm saw the mountain move. It never saw the 3 quiet weeks of an old man's careful rounds, or the frightened clerk who found his courage, or the plain soldier who loved a dead queen's charity, or the heir who held a weapon and chose to heal instead. It never saw that there was no dragon guarding the treasure, only trust, soft and precious and easily poisoned, and that the whole of what happened, from the light under the counting-room door to the proclamation that stunned a realm, was the story of a handful of ordinary men who had decided that trust was worth keeping, and who kept it quietly, lawfully, one door at a time, until the house was clean again. That is the whole of it. That is what I saw. I was only the warden of the keys, the least of the senior posts, the one that guards not the king's body but the doors between the rooms and the boxes and the ledgers, the one no one thinks worth lying to. But I have come to believe in my old age that the doors between the rooms are where a house lives or dies, and that the men who keep them quietly, honestly, unthanked keep more than doors. We keep the trust that the whole great structure stands upon. And when that trust is poisoned, it is not always the sword that saves the house. Sometimes it is only an old man who notices a light where no light should be, and decides, God help him, to walk toward it. The fire is low. My keys hang by the door, though they open nothing of mine any longer. And when the young guards ask me, as they still do sometimes, what the greatest thing was that I ever did in 40 years of service to the Royal House of Harrowgate, I tell them the truth, which they never believe, because it sounds too small. I noticed, and then I did not look away. That was all, that was everything,